My father filmed his early home movies on this Keystone 8mm camera model K8. I learned from the Keystone website that it was first produced in 1936. Irwin must have bought this camera used, as the earliest movie I've found so far was Christmas 1946. The camera used 8mm film in 25-foot spools. Most of Dad's films are taken on Kodak-produced film, and although other brands may have been produced, I'm pretty sure that only Kodak film was available in Mitchell, South Dakota at the time. The 25-foot spool produced 50 feet of movie film, which had a running time of 3 to 4.5 minutes, depending on the speed at which it was run through the camera. Kodak first produced this film in 1932 for the home movie market. How does 25 feet of film make a 50-foot exposed film? Well, it was dual-sided. That means that after exposing the film once through the camera, the film was unloaded, turned over or reversed, and exposed a second time on the other side. The exposed film was then mailed to a special processing center to be developed, and then was returned to the customer for viewing on their home projection equipment. Let's take a closer look at the camera. On the front you'll see the lens with a rotating dial which changed the size of the lens opening. This aperture ring controlled how much light was allowed to expose the film. An exposure chart on this metal plate tells you what lens settings should be used under certain lighting conditions. It was sometimes difficult to get the correct setting on the lens because without a light meter, which few people owned, it was somewhat of an educated guess. Below the lens is a small viewfinder window, which is nothing more than a glass-covered hole, which you look through from the back of the camera to line up the subject you are filming. Below the viewfinder is the shutter release button. It can be pushed in and held continuously while filming, or it can be locked in the on position with a shutter lock on the side of the camera, allowing for hands-free operation if necessary. On the right-hand side of the camera, starting from the top, we have a small dial, which when filming rotates and shows how many feet of film have been exposed. The dial goes from 0 to 25 feet. Then when 25 feet of film have been exposed, you would open the camera and reverse the film and run it again, exposing the second 25 feet of film. Below the dial is a large wind-up handle which winds a spring mechanism to operate the shutter and advance the film. If it were not for this mechanism, there would have to be a hand crank, like the ones you've perhaps seen in very early Hollywood movies. There were no batteries or electric motors to power these cameras. Under the crank is a rangefinder viewing device. This unfolds from the side of the camera so you don't have to look through the tiny hole in the back of the camera to frame your subject. Also on the right side of the camera is the shutter lock button near the bottom. On the back of the camera is a dial used to select the speed at which the film is run through the camera. 16 frames per second is normal, but you could expose the film at 12 frames per second to get longer running time. This would result in action which would be very choppy, somewhat like old silent Hollywood films. Then there's also a setting for 48 frames per second, which when played back shows the action in slow motion. This speed, however, would run through an entire roll of film in no time at all, and would be used very rarely, as film was costly in those days. On the left side of the camera is a simple turnbuckle latch which allows entry to the camera's inside. On the inside you will see all of the inner workings of the camera. The film spool is loaded on the top peg and threaded through the film gate, which is on the back side of the lens, and then onto a take-up spool on the bottom. For best results, this process of changing the film should have been done in a darkened room, or at least out of direct sunlight, so as not to accidentally expose a portion of the film. The film did have a covering of light-proof paper, which helped alleviate this problem somewhat. This is the original leather case and strap that this camera has been stored in for over 60 years. Dad stopped using this camera in the very late 1960s or early 70s when some of the newer Super 8 movie cameras became available. Super 8 films were much easier to use. The film was encased in a plastic cartridge, which meant that you didn't have to fuss with winding film onto spools and through the camera. Also, they had battery-driven motors. Dad took many home movies in the Super 8 format. Someday I'll get those films transferred to a digital format. I've already copied his regular 8mm films. These older films are getting very fragile and may not last many more years. Also, the projectors used to view regular 8 movie films are getting scarce, as are the projector lamps. Kodak Kodachrome 8mm film was most likely the film of choice for most home movie making. It was readily available almost anywhere and was just about the only brand on shelves at popular vacation spots around the country. Dad mailed his films in the original box to the Kodak processing plant in Chicago. After processing, the finished movie film was returned to the sender in the original box. I do not know what the turnaround time was for these, but I would guess it was a little less than 2 weeks. Here is the box from one of the earliest of his films. The simple address on the box certainly is representative of a different era than we are living in today. If this film was shot on Christmas Day, which I believe it was, then the turnaround time was really pretty good. Note the postmark. It had been received in Chicago, processed, and postmarked within 5 days after Christmas. That's amazing, and the postage was only 1 cents. This is an example of the 1940s equivalent of a DVD. Not quite Toy Story or Shrek, but these were available to home viewers who had projection equipment, such as my father had. Dad had quite a few Disney cartoons for us kids to watch, as well as some documentary films. Some of his other store-bought films included a travel documentary of Hawaii, another travel documentary of old Mexico, without the drug cartels and border troubles, of course. He had famous animal acts such as Clyde Beatty with the Ringling Brothers Circus and trained chimpanzees. These were a lot of fun to watch, even though most of these films were quite short. We'd watch them over and over and enjoy a bowl of popcorn on Saturday nights after our baths. I hope this presentation has raised your awareness of the effort that was put forth by my dad and others who were fortunate enough to be able to record their families in the mid-20th century. For them it was a dream come true. Would we bother with such antiquities in 2010? That's doubtful, but it sure would be fun.